Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. Welcome to our Bible study. This is our seventh lesson in our series, Messy People, Life Lessons from Imperfect Biblical Heroes. We've looked at in the past few weeks, we've looked at Rahab, the prodigal son, and most recently, King Josiah. Today, we go back a little further in Israel's history to learn a few lessons from the second king, a brother by the name of David. I think there are some important takeaways that I'm going to share. So I'd love for you to do me a favor and help me get the word out and encourage others to join us. If you're watching Wednesday at 12 or at 6:30, we are now live on Facebook, on Twitter, on Dialpad, on YouTube. And so encourage folk to jump on and join us. In 1st and 2nd Samuel, there are 40 chapters dedicated to telling the story of David, his triumphs and his tragedies. If you want to read all about his life, his ups and downs, successes and failures, including when he made a decision that hurt others and decisions that may have hurt God, I want you to start at 1 Samuel chapter 16 and go through 2 Samuel chapter 24. That should be good reading for you. But our focus for this week will deal with the messiness of criticism and how we handle it. Because let's face it, criticism is hard. It often comes at us from many different angles, many different ways. And if we don't learn how to deal with it wisely, we can find ourselves discouraged, maybe even frazzled, as we see in the following fable. A man and his son were once going with their donkey to market. As they were walking along by his side, a countryman passed by and said, "You fools, what is a donkey for but to ride upon?" So the man put the boy on the donkey and they went on their way. But soon they passed a group of men, one of whom said, "See that lazy youngster? He lets his father walk while he rides." So the man ordered his boy to get off and got on himself. But they hadn't gone far when they passed two women, one of whom said to the other, "Shame on that lazy lout to let his poor little son trudge along." Well, the man didn't know what to do, but at last he took his boy up before him on the donkey. By this time they had come to town, and the passerbys began to jeer and point at them. The man stopped and asked, What are they scoffing at?" The man said, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself for overloading that poor donkey with you and your hulking son?" The man and boy got off and they tried to think what to do. They thought and they thought till at last they cut down a pole, tied the donkey's feet to it, and raised the pole and the donkey to their shoulders. They went along amid all the laughter of all who met them till they came to Market Bridge, when the donkey, getting one of his feet loose, kicked out and caused the boy to drop his end of the pole. In the struggle, the donkey fell over the bridge, and his 4 feet being tied together, he was drowned. "That will teach you," said an old man who had followed them. "Please all, and you please none." It's true, you simply cannot please everyone. There are always going to be people in your life who criticize you and speak against you. It is simply inevitable. You will be misunderstood, misquoted. You will be unfairly judged, attacked, and gossiped about. It's a part of life. If you're swayed by every opinion like the father in the fable, you will not live a very fruitful life. You cannot allow every criticism to determine how you live. But I know this is easier said than done. I hate to be misunderstood. I hate to be misinterpreted. I hate to be gossiped about. But it happens. It happens in my personal life and professionally as both a pastor and as a public servant. And when it does, a variety of reactions cross my mind. It's like different parts of me want to take over and handle it. My mouth wants to defend and set the record straight. My heart just hurts and wants to heal. My mind seeks to understand if what is being said is either truth or jealousy. My soul wants to hug the person and restore the relationship. My feet want to run away and quit putting myself out there for others to judge. And if I'm honest, sometimes my hands want to do some things that are not holy. Criticisms hurt. No matter how many positives we have in our lives, one phone call, one letter, one email, one conversation can turn it all inside out, especially if the criticism comes from someone that we trust or someone who is close to us. These wounds may leave our hearts broken and our minds wondering why we even allow people to get close. In the book Messy People, and we've quoted the author before, Jennifer Cowart, talks about how one comment she heard as a little girl impacted her life and her self-esteem for over 30 years. She wrote about how an older relative told her that she had nice eyes, but her cousin was the pretty one. She says, "I didn't lash out or defend myself. I just accepted these words as my truth. They weren't spoken to encourage me, they hurt. And because I didn't have the tools at 8 years old to process that criticism, I allowed them to shape my view of myself." In her mind and heart, Jennifer came to believe that she was not the pretty one. In fact, when she was elected to homecoming court in college, her first thought was that it must be a campus-wide joke to embarrass her. It wasn't until she was almost 40 years old that she finally looked in the mirror and told herself that she was beautiful. I know many 40 and 50 and 60-year-olds who have similar stories, some who are even in their 20s and 30s. Somebody said something to you as a child and it shifted how you saw yourself, sometimes for the good, many times for the bad. That's why we strive to encourage our young people. Y'all know growing up ain't easy. Kids can be mean, but so can adults who speak to children. Reverend Butler shared something that we may not have thought about. When we returned to in-person worship, we hadn't seen each other for 2 years. Some of us had gotten a little grayer, maybe skinnier, maybe thicker, and many of us had slowed down considerably. But with our young people, so many of them had growth spurts, which is normal at that age. I'm sure you heard it when you were growing up. He's gotten so big. Or when did she get so tall? While our intentions may be pure, we need to think about how these children, tweens and teens, will hear that and internalize it, especially in today's era of hypersensitivity in social media. At least 2 parents or guardians have shared that young people have developed complexes about their bodies, something they have no control over, and they don't want to participate in activities when they feel like they will stand out. So I don't know how to do any damage that has already been done, but I can ask you all to agree with me that we will do our best to think before we speak and avoid saying things that can be considered critical of anyone's appearance, but especially our young people. Now, that's not the point of this lesson, but I think it's important for us to share. Criticism hurts, and how we process it is important. I tend to allow a critical comment to wound me, discourage me. I'm just being transparent. But you may have a more direct response. When attacked, you may attack back. When insulted, you may retaliate, or at least want to. These may be natural responses, but they are not helpful. For 2 weeks, we're going to look at the life of David. David the shepherd, David the king, David the warrior, David the husband, David the father, who was criticized and attacked much of his life. In fact, throughout the years, there were people who spoke badly of him and wanted to kill him. Yet the Bible describes David as a man after God's own heart. So, if this man who loved God so passionately and served God so faithfully was criticized, then we can know that we will have to deal with criticism too. In a sense, form of criticism began when David was young. God sent the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem to find a man named Jesse and anoint one of his sons to replace Saul as the next king of Israel. And Jesse did not bother to call David in from the fields. We find this story in 1 Samuel 16. Those of you who've been around for my whole pastoral tenure, you know that this was the first sermon that I ever preached at this church. 1 Samuel 16. Listen.
The Lord said to Samuel,
"How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king.
But Samuel said,
How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me.
The Lord said,
Take a heifer with you, and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate.
Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked,
Do you come in peace?
Samuel replied,
Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me.
Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought,
Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord.
But the Lord said to Samuel,
Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things human beings look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said,
The Lord has not chosen this one either.
Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said,
Nor has the Lord chosen this one.
Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him,
The Lord has not chosen these.
So he asked Jesse,
Are these all the sons you have?
There is still the youngest.
Jesse answered.
He is tending the sheep.
Samuel said,
Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives.
So he sent and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said,
Rise and anoint him. This is the one.
From this scripture, we see that apparently in the eyes of his father, as the youngest of Jesse's sons, David was not even a serious consideration as someone to be used by God. There are so many messages here, but the one I want you to take with you today is this. If God has called you to a certain position, regardless of the naysayers, even if they are your own family members, stand tall, knowing that if God started something in you, God is going to finish it. One chapter later in 1 Samuel 17, we see David criticized openly by his oldest brothers, by other soldiers, and King Saul when he steps forward with the courage to challenge Goliath.
When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked,
Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle.
Now what have I done?
said David.
Can't I even speak?
He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul,
Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him.
Saul replied,
You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are little more than a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth.
But David said to Saul,
Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine.
Saul said to David,
Go, and the Lord be with you.
Despite criticism, David persisted in wanting to defend Israel's honor by fighting Goliath, which he eventually did. As a teenager, David had to learn to deal with critics. He was able to do this by trusting and relying on God. In the Old Testament, we find that critics would be David's constant companion. Among his many detractors were his brother, king, wife, son, and at one point, even his most trusted advisor. Their criticism stemmed from a variety of sources, including jealousy, embarrassment, greed, and even truth. David had many occasions when he had to ignore and move past his critics, as he did when his wife mocked his worship and when his brother questioned his motives. Then there were times when David needed to stop, David needed to listen and repent, as he did in response to Nathan's rebuke after his sins of adultery and murder. There also were times when David had to confront the criticism, such as his own son Absalom, who sought to take the kingdom from him. Through it all, David always turned to God for strength and truth. Like David, we're going to encounter criticism. Throughout life, people will want to attack us for a whole bunch of different reasons. But also, like David, we can let God be our protector, our savior, our defender, our guide, and even our shelter. At various times throughout his life, David was attacked and even hunted. One of the most volatile relationships he encountered was with King Saul. You heard earlier how God led the prophet Samuel to anoint David as the next king. But let's fill in some backstory for just a bit. For many years, the nation of Israel was led by a series of judges. When the people demanded that God gave them a king to rule, instead, God directed the prophet Samuel to anoint Saul as their first king. Saul was a respected military leader and followed God closely for a time. But as his reign continued, he disobeyed God and did what he chose instead of God's will. So at a certain point, the Lord directed Samuel to anoint David to replace Saul. And when David bravely faced the giant Goliath, despite opposition from his brothers and others, that act of heroism brought him to Saul's attention. For a period of time, David became a constant companion of King Saul and his son Jonathan. In fact, Jonathan and David developed a deep friendship. But in 1 Samuel 18, we find that as David served under Saul's command, God's favor was upon him. Whenever the Philistine army attacked, David was more successful against them than all of the rest of Saul's officers. Even though David's success benefited Saul as king, Saul felt threatened and became enraged with jealousy. When the king realized how much the Lord was with David, he became even more afraid of him and grew to hate him. So much so that Saul started urging his aides and even his son Jonathan to assassinate David. Notice that David had done nothing wrong. In fact, he had served Saul faithfully and with great success. But this success and the love the people of Israel expressed to David is what fueled Saul's hatred. Saul was plagued with jealousy, insecurity, and personal unfaithfulness. Out of these shortcomings came pain in his own life and the lives of those around him. So, how did David respond as an innocent but wanted man? First, he was shocked. David couldn't believe that the one he had been serving faithfully was really out to hurt him. There was denial, which quickly was replaced with fear when Saul tried to kill David. So David ran. And along the way, others joined him for their own safety and the fact that he was a great leader. For years, David lived in hiding. He and his companions often were forced to dwell in caves. On 2 occasions while in the wilderness, David had the opportunity to kill Saul. His men even encouraged him to do so. Saul's death would have ushered in David's reign as king. These stories are pretty fascinating. Listen to 1 Samuel 24 from the Message translation.
When Saul came back after dealing with the Philistines, he was told, "David is now in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Saul took 3 companies, the best he could find in all Israel, and set out in search of David and his men in the region of Wild Goat Rocks. He came to some sheep pens along the road. There was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were huddled far back in the same cave. David's men whispered to him, "Can you believe it? This is the day God was talking about when he said, 'I'll put your enemy in your hands. You can do whatever you want with him.'" Quiet as a cat, David crept up and cut off a piece of Saul's royal robe. Immediately, he felt guilty. He said to his men, "God forbid that I should have done this to my master, God's anointed, that I should so much as raise a finger against him. He's God's anointed." David held his men in check with these words and wouldn't let them pounce on Saul. Saul got up left the cave, and went on down the road.
We heard here that David had the perfect opportunity to eliminate his opposition. While Saul is hunting David, he takes a moment to handle his business. The text says that David, pumped up by his men telling him that God had set it up so that he could take down Saul, sneaks into the cave where Saul is and gets close enough to cut off a piece of his robe. But the Spirit starts working on him, and he tells the men that he cannot touch God's anointed. In 1 Samuel 26, there's another close call for Saul.
So David and Abishai entered the encampment by night, and there he was, Saul, stretched out asleep at the center of the camp, his spear stuck in the ground near his head, with Abner and the troops sound asleep on all sides. Abishai said, "This is the moment. God has put your enemy in your grasp. Let me nail him to the ground with his spear. One hit will do it, believe me. I won't need a second." But David said to Abishai, "Don't you dare hurt him. Who could lay a hand on God's anointed and even think of getting away with it?" He went on, "As God lives, either God will strike him, or his time will come and he'll die in bed, or he'll fall in battle. But God forbid that I should lay a finger on God's anointed. Now, grab the spear at his head and the water jug, and let's get out of here." David took the spear and water jug that were right beside Saul's head, and they slipped away. Not a soul saw. Not a soul knew. No one woke up. They all slept through the whole thing. A blanket of deep sleep from God had fallen on them.
Even though the feeling wasn't always mutual, David had great love and respect for Saul as God's anointed king of Israel, and refused to raise a hand against him. Like Jesus in the face of his accusers, David did not choose to retaliate. It's important to recognize that we too have a choice to make when we face difficulties in life. Usually, we are unable to control the situations around us, although that's often what we want to do. But what we can do is control our response to those situations. Here are 3 biblical principles to help guide us when dealing with hurt. First, listen carefully. James 1:19-24 in the Message translation says, "Post this at all intersections, dear friends. Lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger straggle in the rear. God's righteousness doesn't grow from human anger. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you are a listener when you are anything but. Letting the word go in one ear and out the other. Act on what you hear. Those who hear and don't act are like those who glance in the mirror, walk away, and 2 minutes later have no idea who they are and what they look like. Forgive quickly." I know forgiveness is going to keep coming up because it's a core value of our faith. Colossians 3:13-14 says, "So, chosen by God for this new life of love, dress in the wardrobe God picked out for you. Compassion, kindness, humility, quiet strength, discipline. Be even-tempered, content with second place, quick to forgive an offense. Forgive as quickly and as completely as the Master forgave you. And regardless of what else you put on, wear love. It's your basic all-purpose garment. Never be without it." And finally, to reiterate the end of Colossians 3, love deeply. That's the third thing. 1 Peter 4:8 says, "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sin." Listen, forgive, and love. Remember, life is not always fair. You will not always be treated fairly, but you will always have the opportunity to choose how to respond when hurt comes your way. David chose well in his relationship with Saul. So how will you choose when you face criticism? Almost always, when others criticize us unfairly or speak about us unkindly, we can choose not to retaliate. We can choose to speak, and we can choose to speak with kindness or to stay quiet. In the short term, it is often painful because we would like to set things straight and call people out for their nastiness. But we can know that God is with us. When others speak poorly of us, lash out at us, God is close. From personal experience, I can testify that staying quiet in those moments is difficult, but character truly does win in the end. Take that with you today. Character wins in the end. Now, I hope if you're watching at noon, watching at 6:30, that as we're ending, you're preparing to jump on for our after Bible study chat. Today's question, and each week we have a question of the week. What are some practical things you can do in the moment to keep from fighting back or speaking unkindly when faced with nasty criticism? What are some practical things that you can do in the moment to keep from fighting back or speaking unkindly when faced with nasty criticism? And we're going to talk about that in a second. Join us on Dialpad to discuss our question of the week. Again, what are some practical things you can do in the moment to keep from fighting back or speaking unkindly when faced with nasty criticism? And remember, prayer call tomorrow at 7 a.m. We will be closed on Friday for food pantry. There will be no food pantry at 12 o'clock on Friday. We usually don't do food pantry the weekends of holidays. All right. Saturday, there'll be choir rehearsal at 10:30. And so those of you who are singing, you should have gotten a message by now. There's a full schedule for the choir that should have went out last week for schedules for the year. All right. I will see you in worship on Sunday at 10:45 online or in person. But as soon as we finish this, I will see you in the After Bible Study chat. All right. Take care. After Bible Study chat, 804-203-9011, meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. All right. Looking forward to joining